Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Wow. I'm thrilled to see such a
Wow,
wonderful
it's
turnout tonight.
Great to see such a wonderful turnout tonight.
This presentation is being live streamed through the
streamed
internet.
On the internet. And we will learn how to
For those who may be
present.
interested in watching the presentation. Let
And
me introduce
who might
myself.
be
My name is
interested in
Tim
watching.
Riker. This is my name
I
sign.
am Tim, and
I'm a
the
professor here at Brown.
At Brown University.
There's two different signs for Brown, one across the chest and one
There's different signs.
which is similar to the
Brown
color for
University,
Brown.
like this, is signed by the deaf.
I'm a professor of ASL and Deaf Studies,
And I teach ASL Deaf
and we're
Studies.
thrilled to invite Dr. Sanjay
I'm thrilled
Gulati
to
here this
invite
evening.
Dr. Sanjay Gulati here this evening. He's a doctor that works.
He's a medical doctor at Cambridge
medical
Health
doctor that
Alliance.
Works at Cambridge Health Alliance, and he's been working.
He's
there
worked
for
over 20 years
He's involved
in the
with
field
work with
of deaf and hard of hearing
in the field of
services,
deaf and hard of hearing services,
both at Cambridge Health Alliance
both
and
in
Boston Children's
Cambridge and in
Hospital.
Boston and Children's Hospital.
We'd like to welcome him here
I'd like to
today.
welcome here today. His presentation is very important.
He's giving a presentation on a very important topic,
is focused on a very specific topic.
that of
called
language deprivation syndrome. It's abbreviated as LDS. We're thrilled to have him
We are
here.
thrilled to have him here.
At some point during the presentation, there will be an opportunity for questions and
At
answers.
some point during the presentation, there will be a question-answer portion.
He will lecture for about an hour, at which point we will invite you to come forward and make a line over on the right side of the auditorium. We have a microphone here and interpreters,
And we have a
so you
microphone
can
here
sign
for
or speak your
interpreters, so
question.
you can sign and speak your question.
The reason we're having you line up
We
this
will
way
record
is
this.
so that others in the audience
So
who may be
the
deaf
could see your
questions
when
clearly
sign
as you
them.
sign them. So without further ado,
So without further
Dr.
ado,
Gulati.
Dr. Gulati. Wow, there's a big crowd.
Thank you
today.
so much,
Thank you
everyone, for coming.
tonight.
I'm happy to be here
I'm here to discuss how important
and discuss what I think is one of the most
it is
important issues in the deaf world and in
for
the deaf
issues in the
community.
deaf world and deaf community to be
I
addressed.
call it language deprivation,
I call it language
deprivation syndrome.
deprivation syndrome, or LDS.
My signs are not
My
very
signs are
fluent.
not very fluent.
I learned sign language
I
at the
learned
age
sign
of
language
30.
at the age of 30.
I was born with the ability to
And I
hear.
was born with the ability to hear.
I learned Hindi
I
as my
learned
first
Hindi
language.
as my first
English
language.
was my second.
English is my second.
And those two languages I learned at the age of 1 to 3.
I learned those
So
two
we call that
languages
my
I learned at
L1
ages
or my
1,
first
so we
language.
call that my L1 language.
I learned sign language at the age of 30.
I learned sign language at the
We
age
call that
30
the
at
L2
age
language,
30,
which
so
is
that
language
my
learned
L2
later on
language,
in life.
when I learned it later on in life.
Unfortunately, my voice also is not perfect at this
so I
time,
had
so I had to
to
decide between
decide
signing or
between
speaking, and
signing
I've
or
decided to
speaking.
sign this
And I
presentation
decided
today.
to sign this presentation.
If you find that you can't understand my signs, please let me
If you
know.
can't understand my signs in this presentation, just let me know. You'll notice this painting.
You'll
in the
notice the
background.
painting in the background.
This is
the
a
artist is a
picture of
woman
who had a serious
who suffered
impact
from
on-
serious
and
language
suffered from serious
deprivation.
language deprivation.
I've posted this here for two
I
reasons.
posted this for two reasons.
One, to remind myself and to
I
remind
myself
all of
want to
us
remind all of
that
you
language deprivation
that
is
language
truly
deprivation
atrocious.
is truly devastating. But also
there can be a lot of
going to
joy.
enjoy. Or also there could be a lot of joy. as
This
well,
artist was happy
because we need to notice that this artist was happy
because she was able to move into a group home with deaf
into a
people
group
for the
of deaf
first
people
time.
for the first
She
time.
grew up in a
And she
family
finally had a family that she loved.
who loved
And
her,
communication wasn't an issue.
but there was no communication access. It was very
It was
frustrating for her. It led to very
lead
severe behavioral difficulties. She was finally placed in a deaf home, and those behaviors did a 180 turn. She began to enjoy life and posted paintings. I wish I could tell you I had her permission to show you this painting today. Unfortunately, I do not.
Unfortunately, I do not. But I want you to
Her cognitive abilities don't give her the
to
ability to grant permission. She doesn't understand that concept.
She doesn't understand that concept. You can see two.
Looking at that painting, you'll be able to see two things at once: the words and the pictures.
The words and the pictures.
By looking at the words and the pictures,
you can see that you
can see
signals
the signals with your eyes.
And it's different from the noise. If the picture is more
If the picture was darker, the words being brighter,
the words were more brighter, they would go down.
The signal would go down and the noise would go up.
Noise would go up.
Do you see what I'm saying?
I'll go back to the last slide. Okay.
It's harder to distinguish the words within the painting. That's the signal to noise ratio.
That's the signal to noise ratio. It's not a fun concept.
The issue of signal to noise ratio is complex. There's many elements involved with language deprivation.
Language loss.
I will try tonight to explain them to the best of my ability.
I will try to explain them to my best ability tonight.
I'm not an expert.
I'm
not an expert on the issue
by any means, but I want to.
It's very
share my
multidisciplinary.
professional experience.
It involves the fields of audiology,
It involves the field of
the medical field, perhaps surgery,
and science field as well.
politics as well, disability studies. There's many elements involved.
With this. Look at that picture now, and you can see the.
Looking at this picture now is similar to that of someone who's hard of hearing. You can distinguish the signals within the noise. I was born fully capable of hearing. I lost my ability to hear later in life. I've become profoundly deaf.
I was able to wear, and I became profoundly deaf, and I was able to wear.
With hearing aids and lip reading and a lot of mental work, I am able to distinguish speech. This is an audiogram, a very standard audiogram.
That's explaining about understanding hearing aids and how they really are successful, and shows how hearing aids
I'm going to show you the audiograms, what they really show and how it works.
Work
and also hearing aids.
And also how hearing aids work.
This is the audiogram of what you would call normal hearing child.
A normal hearing child that has 0 hearing loss.
This is based on what an average adult would hear.
It's based on an average person. An average adult would hear.
I placed quotes around the word normal.
And I'll explain why.
And I'll explain why I did so later.
And I will do that later.
Mild hearing loss.
Mild hearing loss.
Moderate and profound.
Or moderate hearing loss.
This was me 20 years ago. So if I was trying to talk to somebody, I could turn on my hearing aids.
And my range in hearing would go up.
My range of hearing would go up on the spectrum.
I was able to take
that way I could read lips and match the auditory input with what I was trying to figure out on someone's lips. Suppose someone would turn on a water faucet in the background.
A person with normal hearing would be able to distinguish between the sound.
A person with normal hearing would be able to distinguish the difference between those two. Unfortunately, with the hearing aids, The water's
Unfortunately,
sound and
hearing
the
aids,
speech
water sound
was
and speech
unintelligible. I could not hear either
And
one
not
clearly.
able to communicate. The communication
My
was
access
blocked.
to that communication was
It wasn't
blocked.
clear. This piece, when I'm wearing my hearing aids, I wasn't able
Hearing aids
to-
are not a solution to
it wasn't a
deafness.
solution to my deafness.
It only moves
There's definitely many different
your input
levels
on the spectrum
of hearing
higher.
loss. It only moves your input on the spectrum higher,
The range is what's important.
but that range is what's important. I like showing this audiogram because it makes it
I dislike
seem
showing an audiogram because it makes it seem like I believe that hearing is about sound, and that's not what I believe. I believe that hearing is really about
I believe
language.
that hearing is really about language.
My definition
My
of
professional
deafness
experience while being
is
deaf,
not about what you would see on an audiogram.
it's not about what you see on an audiogram.
My definition of deaf is a person who can't enjoy easy, natural, learned, spoken.
It's about a
primary
person learning how to
language.
speak and
Does that make
understand their
sense?
first language. Is that clear? It's easy for people to become confused about
It's easy
that
for people to
because
become confused about that.
many times people
Because some people,
like
like
me,
myself, who were born
who are born
hearing, who were able to pick up spoken
and
language
learn language and then become
and
deaf
lost their hearing later in life, as opposed to somebody who was born deaf, have completely different experiences.
If you look back,
If you look back in the history
reading
books
a book about
and you read
literacy
about oral education programs,
and
they always
people who
give great
become
credence to those who succeed
because they
in learning
learn
spoken
spoken
language
as
as their primary language. That's what they label as a success.
That's how I labeled a success.
But if you look at the number of those who
That
succeed,
100%
100% of the time are those who became late deafened,
those who become deaf later in
when they
life
already
have
had exposure to a spoken L1 primary
exposure to a
language.
spoken,
That
one
person
language.
could
So-
then use whatever method
but then we
they were
can use
exposed
whatever
to.
method that we were exposed to.
That method would then be beneficial for them because they had the L1 language before they lost their hearing. Imagine a baby who's born.
And
Babies
baby
need
is
things,
born with
right?
many things, right? We have a mom.
A pregnant mother who uses alcohol will have a detrimental effect on the baby. Babies,
And
once
there's many
born,
different
also need
effects
love.
that babies can have.
And if you're lucky, you will
Whether the
never see the picture
parent is
from an
using
awful
drugs
experiment
or
that was done several years ago.
drinking while pregnant. It can have a lot of negative effects on babies. A survey was done several years ago when monkeys were taken from their mothers.
With the monkeys who were taken from their mothers and left to their own devices. The monkey then has a choice. Wire mom with milk
The mom with milk or a soft entity.
or a
use the mother
soft
without milk.
entity to be used as their mother without milk.
So the baby
Most of those monkeys clinged
to the soft comforting
to the
object
soft,
of touch,
comforting object
more
to the
so
touch,
than the milk.
more so than the milk.
If the baby's left
If you leave a baby without a living mom,
it will die.
the baby will die. Interestingly enough,
If the baby is born
if a
blind,
child is born blind
and it has
without
no
intervention or supports,
interventions, the baby will then later.
the baby will show
delayed
delayed development.
You have
Not
to
only
see
for visual
and moving
aspects,
forward later,
but
when
motor skills as well. They won't roll over until the age of 1
they
year,
won't roll over until they age of
whereas
1 year.
sighted children will
And
learn that skill at 6
Sighted
months.
Children will learn that skill at 6 months.
They won't walk until the age of 3,
They won't walk until the age of 3.
whereas developmentally on target babies learn to walk at 1.
And help visually.
They use their vision to help them figure out how to navigate through the world. Most people don't expect that.
Most people don't expect that. They
With
think
early
that if you help the baby
interventions,
a little bit, it can quickly
a blind
mature and
child can learn to
normally.
develop on par with its sighted counterparts. Similarly, if a child is born deaf, it's more serious.
Similarly,
It's more like a
it's
child
more like
that
a child that's born without a parent.
that's
than the
born
child
without
that's
a
born
parent
deaf
than
and
the child that's born blind.
has serious problems called language deprivation.
If there are non-signing parents, this can lead
But
to
born to a hearing family and
language
they
deprivation
want to
syndrome.
communicate.
A child born with natural access to communication
But they have to have natural access to that communication.
will be able to express its
Social
ideas.
learning is the goal. You don't want to focus on picking out one specific solution for that baby. You have to develop more things.
If a family does not have access to signed language in order to communicate with their child, most families develop what's called home signs, maybe several hundred words that they attach to a sign. Home signs are not language.
What does the language consist of?
And what do I mean by a full language, a complete language?
It means not having complete sentences.
It entails grammar and vocabulary.
Full access to communication includes grammar and vocabulary.
For me, grammar is how you put together words to develop meaning.
Complete sentences.
Vocabulary is more like
a
database or list of words. Some languages have
Language has unlimited words.
a plethora of words. English has almost 1 million words. Some have not so many.
Over 1 million words.
All complete languages have grammar. And whether they have a long list of vocabulary words or a short list, the grammar are equally complex.
Because these are completely different.
Imagine grammar like a machine.
You can imagine grammar like a machine.
If a child has language deprivation, the machine is not able to be turned on.
It's like a machine that you can't turn on.
You may have heard the word grammar in school before. It's used to refer to the rules and ways of using words. That's not what I'm referring to here.
That's not what I mean. Related to
What linguists mean when they say the word grammar. Have a look at this slide.
Let's have a look at this slide. It's very interesting that all people
use language. And that may seem a little bit puzzling. Why isn't there more variety?
Of languages. And
Why don't all human languages have the exact kind of complex grammar, the same kind of complex grammar? People, even with mental retardation, can learn language, maybe unless they have a severe language disability.
And it could be a severe disability.
Language acquisition should not be a problem. What this suggests that is that human evolution,
humans evolve where
humans evolve where language is very important. Without it, we could die.
people with
You need language to
have a
survive.
great life. And that's what they need to survive, compared to all people that have
When you
language.
think of all people having language and then you look at the deaf community,
Communication access.
deaf people are just fine.
In a deaf community, deaf people are just fine because
Deaf people have persevered in the human race, in the human community, since time began. Hearing is not required for living,
hearing is not
but
required.
language is required for living.
Language is
And I want to make
required.
that distinction. I do have a story I'd like to share with you. This is my
about
daughter.
My daughter.
We call her Lucy. And this is at 1.5. She's 4 years old now, of course. My wife and Lucy and I were together. We were visiting my wife's
We're
parents.
visiting my wife's parents, and we were driving there.
And we got to my in-laws' house, and my daughter had a little stuffed animal.
She had received a stuffed animal.
She named it Tasha.
And she named it Tasha.
Well, she was walking down some stairs,
She was walking downstairs,
and she forgot that she left Tasha on the stair. And whoops, she stepped on Tasha and tripped and fell and actually hit her head pretty severely. I watched the whole thing, and of course I was in shock. But you can't believe what she did next. She got really mad, and she stood up and she went right back up those stairs and grabbed Tasha. And then she brought Tasha down with her to me. And then she did the strangest thing. She held up her stuffed animal, and she manipulated its arm. She made Tasha sign an apology. The next day, after this whole thing was over, we were driving home. I was driving the car. My wife was looking at my daughter in the back seat. Lucy was signing to her, and my wife was watching her sign. And my wife said, you know, Sanjay, what's she saying? She's trying to tell me something about Tasha and her head and sorry. Those 3 words are the 3 words that she signed.
These were the 3 words that...
Those 3 words were so powerful, though, and let me tell you why.
Very powerful, so let me tell you.
There was so much information there.
There was so much information there. It was so...
The fact that she had those words and the way she used those words were powerful, and to not have them would be tragically powerful as well. I'll let you go ahead and read this slide.
I'll let you read this slide.
Okay, is it all right if I continue? You? I know this is an odd phrase, theory of mind. Some of you may never have heard of it. What that means is someone has a theory
Thinking about other people and
that
how
other
they
people out there have their own minds, have their own thoughts, separate from themselves. That concept is really
that
crucial
concept
for
is very
human
important for
beings.
humans, because
If you don't have a good theory of mind, it means you can't really empathize with other people.
can't really emphasize.
If you don't have a good theory of mind,
Empathize with other
it
people.
means you can't really empathize with other people. Imagine a child without language, maybe a deaf child born to a hearing family. And they go on the same trip to visit the in-laws.
And say they go visit
And the
them.
child has a stuffed animal, but it has no
And the child has
name.
stuffed animal that
And
has no
something
name.
happens to the child.
And something happens to the child.
And the child comes to the parent with their stuffed animal. They come to the child to be soothed. But what's the experience for that child? It's probably traumatic. They're hurt. They do get soothed, definitely.
They may be very hurt, but they know
But how much is missing?
language is missing.
Imagine. That includes theory of mind.
That includes theory of mind as
It
well.
doesn't happen for the child without language. So this is how I visualize language deprivation. And this happens to children without language exposure again and again throughout their lives. And that's a horrible experience.
Next slide, please.
When I think of my daughter's experience and
Internalized
how she internalized
loss as well.
that
Socialization
experience,
loss as well.
I think about social and emotional lives of children. Socializing is so important for kids.
Hearing
Parents want their children
have
to
language in
use
life
their
because they want to be
language
able to
because of the bond that that implies and the connection to the family life and the family values, and that's important.
The problem
But what if the L1 is delayed?
later
That can be
Very hard to
difficult
learn
to learn
social
socialization.
and emotional lives.
This is a fascinating study.
In this study, a woman
This is a cognitive scientist, psychologist from Italy,
from Italy
who compared two groups, hearing kids who spoke Italian, and then deaf kids who were bilingual and bicultural. And then she compared those also with mainstream children who had a little bit of spoken Italian and also some sign language. The researcher measured
The teacher measured
theory of mind in each of these
found
groups, and she was shocked by the results. And I'm happy to share them.
I'm happy to share them.
There was an
One
ENT
Was an ENT
that she was showing these results to. The idea is to help them and explain to them how L1 is so important. The deaf child had very strong L1 sign language, of course, Italian sign language.
And Italian sign language.
The mainstream kids didn't.
No.
With cochlear implants, hearing aids, and so forth, they were able to pick up words, but their language was delayed. And the ones who had the best theory of mind were the deaf kids. They were much better than the hearing kids even. So I feel badly for the last group of kids who were mainstreamed.
Next slide, please. It's also critical that
Another important study in Holland, in the Netherlands.
Interesting study in
Hearing kids were compared to kids with cochlear implants. The researchers themselves were shocked. No one expected this.
And no one expected
Very strong conclusions. The kids with the implants seem to have okay language. Not terrible, But the theory of mind was very delayed, not even close to kids with regular hearing. I like to call language vitamin L.
Vitamin L. Hearing, vitamin H.
Hearing, vitamin H? I don't think so. You don't need to be able to hear to have an L1. L1 is simply a normal first language. If you look at Western history, there's a lot
about what
of thought about what would happen if you raised a child
and you don't have language.
but you never talked to them. What would happen to that child? And they even did some experiments. It was called the forbidden experiment because even the experimenters knew that it was wrong. It was allowed, it happened. And in the 13th century,
Frederick II said that.
Frederick II said, yeah, I really do want to know what happens to a child who is not exposed to language. What if you didn't talk to the child? The theory, what do you think the theory would be? That maybe the child would speak Hebrew.
The child would speak Hebrew.
The child did not end up speaking Hebrew. However, the experiment worked.
We need to evaluate to understand.
Because they would, people were ordered to feed and care for the children, but not speak to them. The children themselves ended up interacting with each other, kissing, playing. And then the women joined in, the ones who were feeding them.
The ones that are feeding them.
And so that experiment showed that home signs do derive, communication does derive from children to adult, and vice versa. So the experiment was actually a failure.
The experiment was actually a failure.
Language deprivation can happen with hearing people, but not as often as it does to deaf children,
Not as easy.
deaf people. If you Google Wikipedia and you look at language deprivation, you would find the same 5 names.
5 names. Anna.
There's Jeannie, there's Anna, there's a series of them, Casper. All of them were well-known children who had language deprivation. This is, 200 or 300 years ago, meaning that language deprivation in hearing people does happen, maybe twice per century. 5 kids in all that time. But in my clinic, I might see 5 people with language deprivation every single day. Again, if you look at Wikipedia, they never talk about deaf kids with language deprivation. Deaf people aren't even mentioned. We need to change that soon.
Next slide, please. I'm trying to think of a good way to...
I'm trying to think of a good way to suggest critical learning period.
It's critical that...
So a critical period for learning first language. 10 or 20 years ago, we argued about that. But those arguments have more or less been settled. Now the researchers have been proving what happens in the brain.
Scientifically.
Rachel Maybury
has done a
phenomenal amount of research. She's an incredible person. She's been working on language and the brain for the last 30 years. Her most recent study uses fMRI, which means it's a scan of the brain. But it's a special kind of scan that can see which part of the brain is working and which isn't.
A long time ago.
I'm sorry, I'm taking a little diversion, so my apologies to the interpreters. People think, where is language in the brain?
It originates in the brain.
Well, the vision is in the back of the head, in the back of the brain. So if you're looking at something, it goes through your eye sockets and somewhere to the back of your brain. So of course it makes sense then that sign language would be in the back of your brain, right? And spoken language is in the left temporal lobe. So that's interesting that it was sign language would be in a different part of the brain, but in fact, it is not. When you study people with natural fluency, native fluency in sign language, and certainly that would not be me, the language is in the left temporal lobe, in the same place that spoken language is located. What's here? This is fast, rapid processing. That's what happens in this part of the brain. So native users of language, when they see a word, they can't not read that word.
They can't read the word.
It's automatic.
It's automatic that they use.
You see a word, you read the word. It's subconscious, and that happens in the left temporal lobe. I struggle to read French, for example. Now, I'm very much aware of each and every word. I'm aware of how the words look. I know how they feel. I can see the words.
More than just
It's a visual thing. And my comprehension is less accurate. I confuse words. If had I grown up in French, I wouldn't have that confusion. The words would be recognizable automatically. So that is slow processing. It's more tactile, it's more visual, more motor than what happens in the temporal lobe. I've been signing about 20 years. The sign has probably moved to slightly different parts of my temporal lobe, whereas my French, that's moved as well. Because I have an L1 that enables me to reach almost full fluency in another language. Had I not developed an L1, I would never be able to develop any kind of fluency in any other language. Now, Rachel is a very neutral, very scientific, ethical researcher. And this is a statement that she than what happens in the temporal lobe. I've been signing about 20 years. The sign has probably moved to slightly different parts of my temporal lobe, whereas my French, that's moved as well. Because I have an L1 that enables me to reach almost full fluency in another language. Had I not developed an L1, I would never be able to develop any kind of fluency in any other language. Now, Rachel is a very neutral, very scientific, ethical researcher. And this is a statement that she came up with. And I quoted her exactly. I find it very compelling. If you don't have an L1, you have brain damage.
If you don't have language 1, you have brain damage. And
why did people think signs were somewhere in the back of the head? They were confusing it. Excuse me. They were
confusion.
There is visual stimulation, and obviously that visual stimulation registers in the back of the head. But language is a whole different thing, and it registers in the temporal lobe. Now, in the very same lab, people were using more sophisticated tools that allows researchers to see where the brain is growing. It's fascinating. I love these results. I'll let you read the slide and then I'll explain it. Okay. This is surprising.
Right? I know.
So in the
Okay,
back of
in
the
the back
head,
of
which
the
we call the
brain,
occipital
have
cortex or the occipital lobe,
cortex, or the occipital lobe.
it's part of your
It's part of
brain.
your brain. But people
People who were native
communicate
signers
fluently.
had a larger or an additional amount of gray matter in their occipital cortex. And that led people who are native
natural
fluent speakers,
fluency in speaking
well, it turns out they
language.
also have additional brain matter.
Depends on their brain matter.
It's folks who don't have the L1 that are
Interesting.
missing that.
Because the
So
L1 is
probably
missing.
what this means is that kids who grow
If you're
up
born
with parents that name
parents
things,
growing up,
that's a
the
chair,
same thing happens,
that's a book, and so forth.
and so forth.
And that
with
includes not
spoken
only
language as well.
auditory but visual. Those types of
The
stimuli
brain is
stimulate the
stimulated and
occipital
language
cortex.
access is growing more.
And it grows, physically grows.
And it physically grows.
Now, later, if there's language deprivation, it can shrink. And if there's no
And if there's
stimulation
language
whatsoever,
deprivation, the
it
brain
doesn't
can
grow.
actually shrink. Next slide, please.
When hearing
Hearing
parents want
their child,
their deaf children
their deaf child,
to acquire their
acclimate to
culture,
to hearing culture, they need to understand.
they're
that
thinking
there's
about
many different
language at the top
factors
of this
to
list.
Consider.
Parents
Are
worry
worried that they
that kids won't be able to share their
won't
culture.
understand their
But what
culture,
parents don't
and
understand,
they may be criticized for it. And the problem
they can't be criticized for. You can't have
happens because they don't have the
that at the top of the
foundational
list without the foundational steps below it.
steps, and they're very below the average level.
Language does make things
Language does make things and people try to
does many things to help people
to
to process
cognitively.
cognitively.
And to learn language long ago, it may be easy.
There are
but then
languages
you
that can be learned and
forget.
easily forgotten.
And native language users, it may seem like
And it may seem like
but
nothing.
It's a big deal.
But it's something.
Next slide.
Like I said, I'm not a
Like I said, I'm not a
linguist
linguist
or cognitive scientist or a politician. I'm a clinician.
Or a politician. I learn about language deprivation because of my personal
What I've
experience
learned
and
from
people-
language deprivation is from the patients who
patients
come
that
to my
come into
practice.
my practice.
It's very common
That's
from what
what
I've
this
seen.
is. It's very common from what I've seen with deaf
My
people,
deaf and hard of
deaf and
hearing
hard of hearing
consumers
And I want to see this research so I can see what
want
we
to
can
see the
do
research and what the connection
to relate
is.
to this and learn.
And remember my story of Lucy, my
remember the
daughter.
story of Lucy, my daughter, and how she used.
She
those
used
to
words
help
and it helped her so
describe
much to
stories.
convey
That
her
was very
ideas.
powerful. It was a very fun
And
experience.
her fun experience with those 3 words, other children
Because I
without
can't
access to those
express
words
that
would not be able to
in
develop the
relationship
empathy that
of
she did.
empathy with other people.
She
and
would not be
theory
able
of
to
mind
develop the theory of mind,
cannot grow.
and her lobes would not grow. With this deprivation, you would expect a person to exhibit
With this deprivation, you would not
Tantrums.
expect a person to exhibit tantrums. But when you decide,
and from this
from this experience, we decide to measure its official or formal.
experience, we decided to measure it officially or formally.
Next slide.
We used 98 cases.
We used 98 cases
Over a 3-month period.
And we measured the age that they were
We
exposed
measured
to
at what
language.
age they were exposed to language. We measured
We measured the danger
how much of a
they
danger they were to
having
themselves and others.
And to others. Next slide.
In my clinical practice,
In my clinical practice, we've seen less than half the people.
we've seen less than half of people fully develop fluency.
10% did
Less than 10% have
have
serious
serious disfluency.
disfluency.
Less than 10%. The same goes for spoken language fluency.
Similar to spoken language fluency. The green you see in the picture here is normal
In the green, you
fluency.
can see this picture is
Orange is
normal
less so.
fluency.
Red, as you can imagine,
Red, as you can imagine,
is
is
not ideal. Many of our clients,
Many of our clients without proper
early exposure to an
find
L1
themselves in dangerous situations.
find themselves in the severe category. So now,
Now that
using these
people really
statistics, we look for
and what we
connections,
found
and what we
was very
found is
powerful.
compelling.
Wow.
It's
That's really
unfortunate,
sad. It's very
however, not
surprising and
surprising.
sad.
Most adults
Most adults with
with behavioral
issues
issues
stem from frustration and
stem from
not
frustration
understanding
and
language
lack
or
of
having
language and ability to
communication
express
access and not
themselves.
being
They
able
can't
to
empathize with
with
others. They
people
don't know or
because
care
of
how others
their
are feeling.
low state
It's
of
a
mind and
cognitive
concept.
issue.
No, most deaf people probably have some idea of
There are
this,
many deaf
and
people
probably
here
know
who maybe
people
have
who
experience with
suffer
some of
from
these
deprivation.
individuals who require a visual gestural mode of communication. They're unable
There's
to
many different perspectives on the
be a
deaf
part of the
community.
deaf
We
community
know
because
about
of their language deprivation. They're unable
We
to,
have whole classes.
to see multiple sides.
Who don't understand
So we
sign
have
language
CDIs who
and
specialize in communicating with those who are
communication
language
loss
deprived.
occurs.
Remember how I told you with hearing people
Remember how I told
that language
you with hearing
deprivation
people,
happened 5 times
deprivation
within the last
happened
300
5
years?
times in the
And yet
past
we see this
300
every day
years?
in our deaf population.
And what? Yeah, we see this every day in the deaf population. We need to know how to
So how can we
balance
use this
in
information to
these
help
different
us
tools,
fully
such as
identify
cochlear implants and hearing aids, but
whether or
how
not
can
we should
use this
implant
information to fully identify how
cochlear implants
we can change this?
or use hearing aids? And how does this impact those?
If you're deaf and you see
As a deaf
a
person
child with
who comes in
language
contact with
delays,
those who have suffered from language delay, if you see a deaf
and
child
they have hearing
with hearing
and a deaf
parents
student
contemplating
wears cochlear implants.
implanting their child with a cochlear implant,
Yes, they may think that it's good and that's a
they think it's the
Bible
miracle cure
miracle cure
sent from God.
the cochlear implant. The deaf people need to become
They think they can make a deaf person
hearing
become
and use
hearing.
spoken
The
word.
problem with that is
But the problem is this isn't
words
the
are
first
not
language
an
for
L1.
L1. If you have the perspective that
If you have the perspective
deaf
of deafness, that it needs to be cured,
needs to be cured,
that it's a
that's
medical problem, then if a child were to speak a word, any
And then if
word,
your child were
you
to
would
speak
find that a
word, You
success.
would find that a success. That perspective.
We
is
have others with
highly
the
different
perspective that deaf people can
of what
learn a
a
signed
deaf person is
language
capable of doing
and
in
become
learning
a
sign language
minority
as their
language
L1.
user. They think a single word spoken
They think a single word spoken
is nothing to
something
be celebratory over.
hugely
Full,
celebrated.
rich language is what you should be after.
Rich language is what your goal should be.
The signal to noise
The
ratio
signal to noise ratio
that I mentioned
I
before,
just chose random
I just chose
variations,
random results
of
from cochlear
implants
implants
and studies. You can see
and
that no one
studies.
person, or that 1%,
It doesn't give you complete hearing. Those who have been implanted with a cochlear implant
people
catch
with
every
cochlear
third,
implants do not
fifth,
catch
or
every
seventh word.
maybe every third, fifth, or seventh word.
And those
only about
people are
70%
celebrating because they have 70%
have
access to
complete
language. Imagine these people were to read a newspaper and catch 70% of the content. 70% is not enough. There are many issues there, and we'll leave it at that.
Well, anyway, we'll leave it at
I'm
that.
sure there will be
I'm
those
sure
who
there will be
comment
those
on
who
their own
comment on their own
experiences.
experiences.
I think this is pretty self-explanatory.
Being deaf,
It can help you visualize real language fluency.
how the fluency occurs.
The problem is that
there's a wide
deaf
spectrum.
people measure from the top down,
Because you
whereas
go from
hearing
bottom
people
up
measure from the
or
bottom up.
top down. The
Cochlear
results
implant
vary,
outcomes vary, just as an oral education varies.
as in oral education
Some
varies
succeed.
as well.
Some don't.
Some succeed and some don't. And based on this slide,
There's a lot of bias in this report. For example, I remember one graph
is shown
that showed 57 kids who were cochlear
kids who
implanted.
had cochlear implants.
It measured their language
It measured
and
the language
showed
and showed
a positive
And I was
trend.
shocked, wow, really, it really changed
So you would think
and
you
showed a
have to change
positive
your
result.
philosophy. But if you
So if you
take a look at what
the
the report was actually saying, each of those dots was a number.
or each dot.
It started at
represented a
57?
number. It started with 57 and ended up with the number 7.
And ended up at the number 7. So where are the other
Where are the
50
rest of those
children?
50 kids?
I read through the entire research and report.
And I could not find any place.
They
where it
never
talked
mention
about
what happened to the other
mention
50
the
children. I know where they ended up. They are in my practice,
in my
in
practice,
residential
in
therapeutic
residential
schools
and deaf schools.
that cost
The cost
$400,000 a year.
$400,000 a year.
And once they graduate,
Once
they will
graduate, they will
then be sent to a group home.
and they will have cochlear implants.
They
and
have
will
been
not have
implanted, but they
language
don't
fluency.
use the language.
And it really can be an awful experience and an awful impact.
Because they don't have access to the language.
The results have had different outcomes.
If you take a closer look at the
And this
outcomes,
picture
you may
can
see a
help
different
explain that.
picture. Surgeons do
You
the
can have cochlear
procedure,
implants and say, okay, I'm finished and be cured.
and they don't necessarily care what happens to the child as it grows up.
They don't really care what happens to the children as they grow up. They just put their cochlear implants
Can you
on.
imagine a doctor doing a leg
imagine
surgery on a patient and not caring whether or not that patient learns to walk again?
I took
So
an
as we
interview with different
research,
ideas
interview, collecting
and different
ideas,
thoughts with a team that was
we're in a working
working
definition stage right now.
on a definition.
And I do want to hear from you.
And
People with lived
experience
experience.
impacts similar to this.
I want to hear what you think
I wanted to hear what you think
and how you guys
you noticed
recognize language
in the
deficiency. Language deprivation.
Next slide, please. I
would like to talk a minute about emotional response to disabilities.
disabilities.
If you see someone with a
If you see someone with
disability,
a disability, you have an empathetic
you have an
response to them.
empathetic
For
reaction.
example, if you see
For
someone
example,
in
if
a
you see
wheelchair,
someone in a wheelchair,
you're kind of nervous at first and you recognize that that person is not normal.
that person in the
And now
wheelchair may be
you
shocked
compare
by
yourself
your
to that
empathetic
person.
reaction. And you may be a little shocked.
And they have different neurons.
to see a person in a wheelchair.
Understand that makes them different
And the
than
reason being
ourselves.
is because you imagine yourself for just a split second,
And maybe you
what would
imagine
happen to
yourself
you if
in
you were
the
ever
wheelchair
to be
for a
bound in a
second,
wheelchair.
and it hits you.
It's that
very
sudden
emotionally.
realization,
So
that
one minute
empathy
you are
that can be traumatizing. And it's
stuck in
normal.
your brain, and it feels
It's a normal human
It's a
reaction.
normal human reaction to think like that.
But the person in a wheelchair
But
may
that
or may
person
not be
literally
feeling
may not
trauma.
Be feeling
It may have been a
trauma.
traumatic event that led them to be
And
bound
it
to the
may have
wheelchair,
been a
but maybe
traumatic
not.
experience that led them to a wheelchair, but
Maybe
maybe
that
not.
person
Maybe
just
that
does not want to adapt.
person is happy
Maybe they are
being in a
happy and
wheelchair.
content.
Maybe that
Maybe
person
that
is filled up by having
person
people
is
come
fulfilled
and
by
ask
having
them
people come up to them and ask them what happened to
what
them.
happened to them.
Or maybe that person doesn't want you to see the
Or maybe
wheelchair,
that person doesn't want you to see
just to see the
wheelchair.
person. But you
But
can't
you
know
can't
that
know
beforehand.
that before.
And it's normal to feel
So it may be awkward. but
unaware
that's
of how
okay.
to proceed. But it's important to
It's important to
distinguish
distinguish
a recent trauma from a chronic trauma.
chronic trauma. If I label someone not normal, what does that mean, not normal?
What does it mean to label someone not normal? Is there a
Is it
boundary
that we all are the same?
where a normal person is inside
Is
the
there a boundary
boundary
between a
and
normal
abnormal
person and
people are
abnormal
without that
person?
boundary? It's not so clear cut.
That's not clear cut. So the idea
The idea of
being
normalcy
normal
comes
comes
from
where?
an
Way back in
arbitrary,
history. The idea of normalcy becomes an arbitrary. And this is on a wide spectrum.
So the idea of normal is
It could be as a
basically, you could think of it as on a curve.
normal or abnormal.
There's a curve of normalcy, a bell curve.
Or this can be called a bell curve.
If you think of Western
In
tradition,
Western tradition,
there have been different
talk
ideas
about
about
having
people with differences
differences
historically.
they are called
And there is a
ideals.
vision that's called an ideal vision. Who is ideal? No one.
But who is ideal? No one?
We are all
Again,
somewhere
on that line.
on
Some
different
people
sides of the
are close
line.
to the
There is
top.
no ideal person.
Some people are lower on the line.
But we're all in the same circle.
Same circle.
I think that's a better way of categorizing human beings.
I think that's a better way to categorizing humans, that we're on the same circle.
Most hearing people think that hearing is normal.
Think that hearing is normal. You can
But who can
provide
prove that?
evidence, and you
I may have a
provide
different
proof
idea.
that.
Maybe I think that
You
hearing
That
exists within a
hearing
range.
exists within a range.
Some people have more hearing than others.
Some
It's
people
like
have
some
more
people are
hearing than
taller
others.
than others.
And just like
Some
someone else
people
is
hear more
taller
than others. Some people hear less. And I think they're all normal. I can call them all
I can
normal
call
if
them
I
all
want
normal if I
to.
want to.
That is a philosophy.
That
It's
is
a
a
value
philosophy.
issue. It's
value
philosophical. It's a value issue. Maybe it's a medical issue. But I think
So
I should stop now and give you time for some questions and discussion.
Questions and discussion.
If you don't mind lining up by
If you
the
don't mind lining
microphone,
up
if you have
by
a
the
question,
microphone, and come on down.
and come on down, don't be shy. I know you have some great
I know
ideas.
you guys have some great ideas. Okay.
Okay. I'll go ahead and start with the first question, and I hope you all have some more questions and that we have a nice, healthy line. Don't be shy. Really.
Don't be shy, just come on.
This is an open forum. This is what I'd like to know. You said that, if you, let's say you have two hearing parents, and they have to make a decision about what to do with their deaf child.
Their deaf child.
And your best recommendation, what would your
suggest
best recommendation be? Well, I'd want to understand who they are.
Understand who that person is.
I'd want to understand what are their fears.
What
What are their
their
concerns?
fears, what are their
What are their
concerns,
interests?
and what are their interests.
In Massachusetts, I would need to know where they're
I would
from.
need to know.
Massachusetts
I would need
has
to
something
know
like
where they're from. Massachusetts has
358
something like 350
towns.
that have different impacts.
Each and every town is
on
responsible for
special
special education. Can you imagine the politics? Some provide sign language.
I want to provide some sign language.
Some towns provide cochlear implants.
Some
It's
towns provide
ridiculous.
cochlear implants.
They don't so much think about
They
the
don't think much
kids,
about the kids.
but truthfully, each
Very
town has
small
its own philosophy. So I would need to know that. And then I would open up the conversation.
For open discussion,
I would really be interested in their fears and their concerns.
First.
What are their feelings? Are they
What are their
afraid?
feelings? Is it
I
normal
mean,
to
it's
be
normal
shocked
to
if
be
you
a
have
little bit
child
shocked
and
if you have a deaf child and you're hearing.
confused of what to do.
Sometimes when the parents meet a deaf person, and I'm a deaf person,
Parents need to
they
meet
calm right down.
And they
So
calm
we'd have a
down.
conversation, and the conversation would go on for quite a while. It wouldn't be a short discussion, it would be a very long discussion. It's funny, if you say if I meet a parent have a newly born deaf child, I mean, I continue to meet with parents regardless of the age of their child. And quite often, they have 40-year-old kids. I have 40-year-old kids in my office, and the parents are 60, and they come in and they're devastated. It really doesn't matter how old the child is. It has to do with the definition of success, and every parent may have a grieving process that the child somehow doesn't meet their expectations, and it's normal.
And that is normal. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi, I'm a student here.
My question for you is,
My question is, in your medical training,
in your doctoral work,
did you
about
learn
different
this information?
information?
Actually, it's two questions. Where did you learn this information? My first question is about your
and
training
your practice
to become a
becoming
doctor.
How did you learn that you wanted to do that?
And where you're working now,
And where you're working now, where did you
get this information? Because it's so important.
Critical to have
A lot of
many doctors
doctors,
that want to,
and a lot of hearing parents,
well, a lot of hearing parents,
when they
want
have a deaf
that
child,
their kids are born
they
deaf
don't know
and
what to do, and so they ask the doctor. But a lot of doctors really don't have that expertise. They don't have advice to give. So
So I know that's
it's such important information.
to give, but I'm asking, well, do you know what to do
So
in that
where can people
situation?
get that
How to
information?
share that information.
It's a great question.
That's a great question. And I'm
Really, it's
shocked
kind
to
of shocking
hear
that
the child was born deaf. into a
it's
hearing
the
family.
number of deaf people
That a number of people
that exist, and yet how many hours in medical school do we
have spent
spend
many hours
studying
in
it?
medical
I mean,
school
we
to
study
help
diseases for
life.
thousands and
We study
thousands of
diseases
hours.
For thousands and thousands of hours.
But when it comes
when
to
it comes
learning
to
about
learning about
deafness, there's very little
There's
time
very
spent.
little time spent.
You
It's a
need to learn from the
perspective that
perspective of deaf people.
Need to learn from
And
that.
oftentimes all we
Not
learn
trying to
about
learn
is hearing and the improvement of
improvement
hearing.
of having
Some families will have
sign
many,
language,
many surgeries. And I understand that perspective,
and how
but
there
I
may
disagree
be
with it.
many surgeries that are involved.
I think that you
We
should try to improve.
You should try to
You should try to change.
change. It's semantic.
It's semantic, the idea, again, as I said earlier in my talk. It's cosmetic. And I'm sorry to the interpreter. You try to make the
You need to make
person, asking a hearing parent to learn a different language
and evaluate
is a challenge. Imagine, let's say there's a new disease called French. French
when there's a new
disease.
disease called French disease.
Okay? So what happens? Your
And what
child is
happens if they're
born
born to that?
and
yes,
they
can
could learn French, no problem. It would be the most natural thing in the world.
But they would have difficulty learning English.
But they would have difficulty learning English. Now,
What people don't
what would you
really understand when
do
the
if your child was born with French
child is
disease?
born to French disease,
I think you would move to France. Or you would send your child to a bilingual, bicultural school that used both French and English.
And English.
Well, what if there was a
And
cochlear
there's a
implant
cochlear implant that
and the
can
child could
also
learn some English, maybe
Maybe
not
not
full
full
English,
English,
but
but
some English. Maybe
maybe
25% fluency and 75%
of learning
very
English.
difficult, not very fluent. Would you give up
and be not
going to France or going to a
would you give up
bilingual
on going to
program?
France, or would you go to a bilingual
I think
school?
that's part of the problem,
I
is
think
the
that's
way
part of the
people
problem,
conceptualize
the way
it.
people conceptualize this.
They need to understand that ASL is a full and complete language. And that's what I teach
that's why
when I teach in
we
medical
teach-
school.
when I teach
I
in
make
medical
sure that
school,
Harvard
I
medical
make sure that the
students
Harvard medical
get this
students get
information. And oftentimes it's the first time they've ever heard it, which is sad.
And oftentimes it's the first time they've ever heard it, which is really sad. Thank you. How's your dog?
Hi, there's a little exchange going on about a dog. How's your dog? Long story.
Okay,
Over here.
I have a question for you.
I agree with what you're talking about,
I agree with you when you're talking
LDS, and how devastating it is. When you think about
when you think about
language acquisition, some of my students have that.
How
And
they can have that and how it becomes official. We really need
as
to
this
educate
becomes
them.
official, we really need to educate the hearing public. Who is going to educate
Hearing
them?
public who's going to
Some of
educate
their
them.
labels are really incorrect.
And it's important for us
And
to
who diagnosed
encourage
them?
that. And how do we find out who
Well,
diagnosed
that's my life goal, is DSM-6 to actually have a diagnosis.
Actually have a diagnosis. In the last few years, research has now become so
In the last few years,
solid
research has now become so solid.
than years past.
Before it was
thinking about
speculative,
different ideas,
but now we have some clear results. If you don't have an
So
L1,
if you don't have a
you
language
have
one,
brain damage.
You have brain damage.
It cannot be
And
resolved.
they want to make that clear that
And there's no more arguing.
There's
We've
no
got
more
evidence of
arguing.
this,
We've
so
got
it will
evidence of
become
this.
a DSM diagnosis. We
And
have
we
the
have
evidence,
from
we
a
didn't
long
have
time
it
ago.
before.
and we didn't have the evidence before.
What can we do now?
What should we
Well,
do?
it's happening.
Well, it's happening.
Good, because we do need these diagnoses. Hi.
Hi.
I think I met you before,
about 15 years
about
ago.
15 years ago. I was your
Right.
client. Anyway, long time no see. I don't know if you remember me.
I have.
Oh, I'm so sorry, I don't. Well, anyway, I was
I was
little,
born
I
deaf
was
and learned sign
signing,
language
and I
and
went to the school
went
for
to
the
deaf
deaf. I was
school
also
and mainstream
mainstreamed,
school,
and
I
there was a lot of
cochlear
talk about
implant,
implants, and I didn't want one. I thought I was fine without
and
one.
then I thought I was fine
But
without. I was interested in
I was
joining the
interested in
military.
joining the military, but I asked if I had a
And I asked
cochlear
if
implant, could I join? And
I
they
had
said
a
no.
cochlear implant if I could join.
So I had
And
to
they said,
live with
I
that.
had to live with that.
But I thought maybe for general communication, to be able to talk to hearing people, to do well in the hearing world, to go to job interviews. But I don't know.
But,
It
you know,
seems
I
like
think
it's
now
not necessarily, it
it
doesn't
seems like it's not
necessarily work
necessarily
that way. I think this is God's plan. And you just have to trust in God.
And that you just have to trust God.
And you don't need to have a lot of
You don't need
medical
to have a lot of
interventions,
medical
that we are what we are.
interventions to help you learn how to hear and speak. I think that it's a disability.
I think that a
in general-
disability in general
That a disability in general is hard.
is hard.
It's hard to make decisions.
Society
that
labels what a disability is.
Society labels what
So
disability
if all of the
is.
doors were short,
All of those doors were short, and
all those who were taller than the door would feel disabled
Would feel disabled because they would have to
because it would be
struggle
a struggle for them
door.
to get in.
Right, yes. But when I went to
Yeah,
deaf
but you know,
school,
I'm a chef. I have a lot of
and I have a lot of
qualifications. I work in Cambridge.
I work
I'm
in
really a
Cambridge,
skilled
and
individual, but I
I'm
have
a really
difficulty
skilled
with job
individual,
interviews.
but
I
I have
feel
difficulty
like
with job
people
interviews.
minimize my
People minimize my
skills,
skills,
even though I'm
even though
well
I'm
trained.
well-trained.
And I wonder if I should
And I
get a
wonder if I should
cochlear
get a cochlear
implant to
implant to
somehow
somehow
be more employable.
Well, society is changing.
Well, society is changing.
It will allow you to engage
Allow you
without
to engage
changing who
without
you are.
Changing who you are.
Right,
remember
but
when I went to the
you know, when you
doctor,
go to the doctor,
They ask me
they
for
always
an
ask me if I
implant,
want an
and
implant,
if I wanted
and
an
it's like,
implant.
I don't know why
And
they
it's like,
keep
I don't know
asking me
why
that.
they
It's
keep
like,
asking me.
I think they just
I
want
think
the
they just
money,
want
to
that
be
money.
honest.
To be honest.
Well, some people do make a parallel.
Well, some people do make it parallel.
Sometimes it's harder
Sometimes
as
it's harder
a
as a
racial minority, for example, black
black
people. It's harder to,
to
get along in the
get along in
culture and
cultural
society.
Right.
They feel that it's
for the
important
system to learn
for the
about
system to
diversity
learn to
through
live with diversity
changing
through policy change.
policies.
America has a
But it's
very
a
strong value
that we must
on equality.
on equality. The deaf community
And the deaf
culture
community and deaf culture
has many
makes a
values
good
that
argument for equality. And we're
make
making our way
equality
there.
possible, and we're just
And
making our
just
way
as you're
there,
here, we can
just as you are.
talk
We
to
can
the
do it
many
together
hearing people that are here.
and talk to
We
many
have
hearing people. We
interpreters at our disposal.
Right.
Right,
it's
but,
not
you know,
universal in
it's
the
not
world.
universal in the world. We have kind of a separate
have a separate
experience. I feel like we're a
experience.
small group. The whole
And there's
world
many
doesn't
different
understand
people
us. I wish they
that-
would be more
Many types of
open-minded.
people that understand different things. I
We
wish
need
they
more
could be
national
open-minded.
exposure.
We need more national exposure.
And we wish the whole world was bilingual. I'm sure most of you are aware of Martha's Vineyard. Some know of
I'm
it
sure
and
most
some
of us-
don't. It's
some
a
of them
very
know that.
interesting
It's a very
example.
interesting example.
In the 1600s into the
In the 1600s and
1700s,
1700s, people from England moved
people
to
from
America, and they
England
were
moved
congregated
to
in that
America.
area.
and they congregated on the island of Martha's Vineyard. There was
The
a group
island
of
of
people who
Martha's
had
Vineyard.
a
And
gene for
everybody-
deafness.
Most people were deaf there.
And
they were
when they
able
arrived to that island, they
pass down
intermarried
the
and
genes
had
of
children.
deafness.
And before you know it, a
intermarried and
quarter of
had
the
children. Before you know it,
population was deaf.
Most of the population was deaf. And ASL was the first.
Everyone knew sign language. The
everybody
entire
knew sign language.
island was
Everybody's
bilingual.
L1 language.
And ASD, the American
And
School for the
ASD,
Deaf,
American School for the Deaf, when
it was
opened
set
their
up,
school,
had
had
a
a high school satellite on
high school
Martha's Vineyard
satellite
up to eighth
on Martha's
grade.
Vineyard up to 8th grade. Deaf people
Deaf
were allowed to leave,
leave or come
go
freely,
for a 4-year education
or
in
they
high
might-
school and come
they
back
would
to
come
the island.
island.
Deaf people had a better
Deaf people have a
education than
better
others at
education
that
than others
time.
at this time. Yeah, that's perfect. That's
Thank you. I
good
appreciate this
I'm
discussion.
happy
I
was able to
appreciate
discuss
talking with you. I'd love to talk with you again
Love to
about
talk to
this.
you
We have a ways to
another time
go.
about this. Yes, we're very lucky.
I'm very
in sign language,
fortunate
and I know
because for me, sign language
I'm
means I
very
can
fortunate
continue to
because sign
work
language is
in my discipline. And I
what
feel very
learned later in
fortunate
life
to
and
have
continue
enough
to work my
respect
discipline. And I
to
respect to hear stories like yours.
hear stories like yours. I'm humbled
And I'm
by
very
that.
humbled by that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Alex.
Hi, my name is Alex,
Thank
and I
you
want
for
to thank you
coming.
for coming. This was a
I
really
enjoyed
great
the presentation. I have a
presentation.
question for you
I have a
about what type
question about, you didn't really comment about reading
I didn't really comment about your
and reading and how that has to do with the
development, your
L1 or the development of the
language.
L1.
So I was wondering about
I was just thinking, does reading at a young age
does reading at a
help
young-
in
young
any
age
way?
help in any way?
Again, like I said, I'm not an expert
I'm not an expert
on
on
literacy,
literacy,
but
but
there's
there
different areas
different
involved
areas
with reading.
involved
And
with
my
reading that
understanding is that people who read
Feel
well
good,
early
and
on
that we need to have
must
available
have
for
some
people
understanding of
for their
phonetics.
understanding.
And without that word-to-word
And
connection,
without that word
doesn't make
to word
sense.
connection, it doesn't make sense.
On the
for
other
deaf
hand,
students to
if
read
people
at
have a
young age.
strong
On the other
L1
hand,
with
if people have a
sign,
strong L1 with sign,
when they
are
approach
young,
school
they
age,
can
they're able to learn
learn that
the
later.
English word for
But the English word
cat
for cat
using the signed L1 to
and the
explain
L1 to explain
the English word
to make
cat.
that connection.
So they already
And
have the
that concept
concepts that have been
can be
developed with their L1 that they can
related to
use
that
to then
English word.
scaffold them to
When I
learn
develop
English
my
as their second
L1
language.
I will
So it
give
sounds like you're
opportunities
saying you
for
need
that
an
process
L1 in order
reading.
to acquire
Okay.
your L2.
Thank you. It's good to read.
We have
It's
two
so
good studies that
cool.
show that those members of the deaf community that
English strong
have
English-
strong English literacy,
most of them have a strong
most of
ASL
them
as well.
have strong ASL skills.
Thank you.
Come on, people, we got to get some more people down here.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, I
I
really
really
appreciated
enjoyed
many of your
many
points tonight.
parts
Thank
of
you so
your
much for coming.
presentation. Thank you for coming here today.
And I'm really interested
I'm
in your
really interested in
publication.
your publication.
Is this published? Have you published
Is
this?
it released?
I will post this on the web. I will
post
give the
this
email address
on
to Mr.
the
Riker,
slide.
and
I'll
he
give
can
the email
post it
address
on,
To Mr.
it's also
Richter,
posted
and
on the
post it
Cambridge Health Alliance
also
website with all of the references.
on the Key
of
Cambridge
who
Health
I
Alliance
mentioned.
with references that I mentioned. Great.
Great, thank you. Also, the research is a pilot
But also
project.
research is a
which we're working on. That will be published probably within the next 2 or 3 years. It takes time.
Takes time.
Okay, here's my question. I work with children and have been doing so for more than 20 years.
I've been doing it
Graduated
for
from
20 years.
Gallaudet in 1990, and I
graduated
worked
from
at the
Gallaudet in
Learning
1990
Center
and
for
worked
6
at the Learning
years
Center for 6
in the
years.
Bye-Bye program.
So
And I've seen a huge change in the improvement of language in children and self-esteem.
And I hope it continues.
Then I moved to Rhode Island.
But when I moved to Rhode Island,
And my experiences here are different. I see less and less
began to
opportunity for
lessen
kids
the
to develop an
development
L1. What can we
When a
do
baby
when the
is born,
child is
yeah.
born? The parent,
The parents are
you know, you talk to people, they talk to other women about,
Confused and
other
don't know what to
parents
do.
about what to do. So far, what's been happening is in the general field, it's
So since
medical
they develop
doctors who
different
say they should let the
medications.
parents decide on how to raise the child.
in the medical field and
But
decide
how can they make an informed decision? Parents
have to
can't make a
decide what they
decision. I
wanna
mean,
do,
maybe
if
they can make a
want to
decision about certain things,
make decisions
but
about
most
certain
family
things
members don't
and
know
make
anything about
comments
deafness.
of
And so
how to set up language
the
for
access
their
to that
child.
information is missing. We need to involve deaf
And
people,
as when we
deaf
do that,
mentors.
people are involved
Also, there needs to
that
be
have
good
facts and
quality
evidence that
research
shows
to prove
how these
that educating the
opportunities
parents about L1 for their children is
improve their
critical.
L1 language.
Maybe parents sign with their
parents can sign with
kids,
their
but
kids,
there's not full language access because they're signing and talking at the same time.
home signing,
Many of the
talking at the
words are
same
not
time.
actually signed. Or they'll sign and then they'll turn around and keep talking and the child has missed what they're actually saying.
And the child
And in a family situation, the same thing
it's the same
happens.
idea.
No one's
And I know
perfect,
no
but
one's perfect, but
it's so important to show the families
show what
research
proof
so that they,
and what
there's a better
approaches,
educated approach to
the
change
approaches that
what's
we can
going
make
on.
to achieve these goals and change.
And I guess my point is,
So my question is, what
we're
goals
talking about
develop
L1 and the language
in
deprivation
the language
syndrome.
of deprivation syndrome? How many
And
more
then the
lives
idea
do
of
we
putting
have
this in the
to
DSM-6.
influence and impact a change to happen and support?
How can we help these
values,
parents?
and how
And I'm
can we
sorry
help
for the
them?
interpreters who are trying to figure out what I'm saying as I'm figuring it out. How can we get the
So
word out so
more
that more people
exposure can
understand
happen.
language deprivation syndrome? And
And now someone's maybe
when you have
20 or
someone who's maybe
14 years
20 or
age,
14 now, where they haven't gotten
and they don't know
formal
what to
language,
do when
we want to get it to
haven't
the
gotten
little
formal
kids as
language
soon as
yet.
possible.
I know there's many different ideas.
There's a wonderful
that I'll
book
add to the reference list.
that I will add to the reference list as I post it. The book is not about
The book is
deafness,
not about deafness,
but it's about surgery
about
on children
surgery on
with
children
facial reconstruction.
reconstructions. That
The author of the
author
article
of the article
is a woman. She had many paralleling
and she has many
issues.
paralleling issues.
She had a facial deformity, and her parents
deformity, and her parents
freaked out that she wasn't normal, and her parents decided to go ahead with the
so her parents
surgery.
decided to go ahead
And
with the
she
surgery.
had 25
She had 25
surgeries
surgeries to change her face.
to
make it
change her
appear more
face to
normal.
make it appear more normal.
But
But later in life, the woman, looking back, was thankful to her parents, but often they don't.
But often they don't.
The surgeon
realize
showed an
that
awareness
the
of
surgeon showed
the
awareness
social
of the
aspects,
aspects
the
of
label of
having
normal or
those
abnormal.
deformities, a label of normal or abnormal.
And I think that's
And I
an
think that's an
example, I hope,
of
the changes that can
people
happen.
can understand.
There are other
They
things
can
involved. It's not only hearing,
And it's not
but
only hearing,
identifying
different-
self-esteem
but identifying
and a
the
sense of
self-esteem and a
belonging.
sense of belonging for any disability.
So what happened to this person was
So what
awful.
happened to this person
and
was awful, and the child was suffering.
Children suffering language delays is
Language delays is
equally
equally
terrible,
terrible.
but my hope is that we can
But
do
my hope
something
is that
about
we
it.
can do something about it.
What you said about a child just saying one word and the parents getting so
they celebrate.
excited versus a child being actually fluent in sign language. I mean, you know, the evidence is there. It makes such a difference.
It doesn't mean I'm against cochlear implants. I want to make that clear. I am pro L1. There are some children
There's some children
who
who
thrive with a cochlear implant and can develop spoken language, and they do just fine.
And they can do just fine.
On the other hand, there are many
But on
children
the other
that
hand, there are
don't.
many children
And what
that
I
don't.
am focusing on are
That's what I'm
them.
focusing on them. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Heather. I was born deaf, and I work for an agency that provides home-based services for deaf and hard of hearing children and their families. The services are based in the home, and I see a wide range of things happening.
Spectrum of
There might be a third language in the
maybe there's
home.
a third language in their home.
There might be someone who signs, another person who does English, another person who uses Spanish. And there's one situation where there's a hearing parent that is trying to force the child to speak. But my question to you is this: with L1, if they don't have, you're saying it causes brain damage. Without one, you have brain damage. I mean, is there any chance for that child later on with a lot of exposure, or is it a hopeless situation? Because should we just be looking at these children without an L1 as having brain damage? And I have questions about that and also about culture. The label is what concerns me, though.
Labels what concerns me.
One thing is that each person is
different
probably
impacts on
different,
people.
just like a plant. A
Just like a
plant
plant.
requires water every
A plant
day
requires every day
to nurture it to grow.
If we don't do that, the plant
If
will
it doesn't
die.
have water, it will die. Other plants, you can water once and not
other
come
plants
back
can
again
come
for 3 weeks and water
once
it
every
again, and the
couple
plant
weeks,
does
it'll be
just fine. And I think that's why
I think
you see such a gamut in the results from cochlear implantation. Some do very well, some it doesn't work at all. And we don't understand why that is.
We don't understand why that
And that's
is.
one issue that we face.
That's one issue that we face.
And I lost my train of thought.
And I lost my
Well,
train of
I'm getting to the idea of
Well, I'm
brain
getting to the
damage
idea of brain
and
damage and
any hope for that. How can we, what can we do about that? I'm trying to make a judgment in my own mind about these
I'm trying to make
families,
its own judgment.
the children who can't express themselves.
We don't know when it's too late.
We don't know whether it's
So
too
your
late yet.
experience with
So
visual,
your experience
gestural
with
communication,
visual gesture
once that is their only mode
developed,
of access to communication, that's when you would say it's
that's
too
the only
late.
mode of access.
But as far as the critical time
Communication, as far
period,
as the critical
it's a
time
straight
period, it's a straight
line.
line.
And it's an average. And average does
And it
not mean it
doesn't mean that
applies
they
to
have-
everyone.
They don't have opportunities to grow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, language development
Normal
from
for-
6 months, a 6-month-old
Language development
child
from 6
can,
months.
a hearing child
Your
can
child
hear
can hear sounds, phonemes,
sounds,
that can be
phonemes that
associated
they
with
can associate with language.
language, so they can tell.
And
the
they can tell the difference from one
language
language to the next. So normal language acquisition starts really the day
to
you're
another. Normal language
born.
acquisition really starts the day
And for
you're
deaf
born.
kids,
And for deaf kids, they are diagnosed at age
if they're
1.
diagnosed at age 1 or 2, it's too late already.
Or
If they're
2, it's too late
diagnosed
already.
as deaf at age 3 or 4,
If they're
it's tough.
diagnosed at
Age 5, it's
deaf at age
really,
3 or 4, it's
really
tough. And 5,
bad.
It's really bad.
So language is
So
what it's
language is
all
what it's
about.
all about.
So here's my question is, when is it too late? When do we give up?
So
I
when do we
mean,
know
I don't want to give
how
up.
we
I want to
can
keep trying
help
to
the
develop
child
these children.
be successful?
Oh, you have to keep working at it, and
Oh,
really
you have to
immersion
keep
is the only
working at it.
way.
Really immersion
It's
is
what
the
we
only
call
way.
a language emergency if a child has reached the age
If a
of
child
4
reaches
without
the age of 4
appropriate
without appropriate
exposure to an
sign
L1.
language, to an L1,
So if a child comes to the age of 4.5, we consider that
You have to
a language
consider that
emergency,
brain
and
damage.
we
Language
recommend
emergency, we recommend
complete immersion, 24-hour
immersion,
access
24
to the
hours
language,
access
because
to
the
language
window
because the window
is coming to a close.
Okay, thank you.
And it's interesting. I've
Yes, it's
seen
interesting.
many
I've seen
examples of kids at the age of 12, 13, 14, even 20, who are exposed to language at the first time, who come here from other countries. And they can pick up a lot,
And they can pick up on the language really
but
fast.
unfortunately they
And the
can't
fluency
become
comes
fluent.
naturally.
They have an immense
Unfortunately,
vocabulary. They
have
can
immense
learn
vocabulary that they need to learn.
more vocabulary, but
But for
most of the time
most
it's
of the time
hard for them to progress
and to
in the
have
cognitive process. For example, why
process and
something were to
culture that they
happen.
need to be. For example, why something were to happen.
So they can
So they can produce nouns
and
and
general ideas, but they can't produce the expanded clarification of what it is they're meaning. They would expect you to fill in the gaps.
Hi, my name is Michelle,
My name is Michelle,
and I'm a school psychologist at the Rhode Island School for the Deaf. And I have a comment and a question. My comment, well, you were talking about early intervention and the National Association of the Deaf and the Council on Educational Management. There are several organizations that are getting involved in this now with early intervention. And lots of different specialists are involved on the early intervention team. We have to get people to come together and work collaboratively to be involved in the early education field. That's so important. Thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you for mentioning
And also,
that.
I believe Gallaudet has a program called Infant Toddler Family Program, where people actually learn about how to do that early intervention with deaf and hard of hearing babies. But here's my question. We do get children at our school who come here from other countries, or they may not communicate with their parents at home, and they've missed that critical language learning period. And people come to me and say, how can we help these kids? And it's just so hard to tell a parent that they've missed the opportunity, that the window is closed. And I don't know what to do to help them. It's hard for them to take state exams. It's hard for them ever to meet the standards that our state education system sets. It's hard to say to these parents, it's sorry, too late for your child. So how can you help me with this?
How can you help me with this?
It's awful, I gotta say,
really.
but
And
sometimes it's what needs to be said. And
But you
remember
understand
the
that.
painting I showed at the beginning.
Remember?
That painting showed
that
someone who
woman
had
had no
almost
language.
no language.
The painting shows language. About
About 100 signs,
and
nouns, but they couldn't put them together to make a fluent story. And yet they could paint.
To make a fluid story.
So those
So
with
that is
language
deprivation, but
deprivation are still
we are
human.
humans.
And we have to value
so
everything
able
about
to
that person that we can.
Value that. And we can
And I know for myself, it's very important
have
for
a
that
very
person to know who they
important for
are
that person and have an impact for them.
and for them to know that they have language deprivation. At the age of about 14 or 15, you can start to do psychological
And at the
testing
age
and
of
share
14,
those
you
results
start
with
psychological
that
testing and
individual.
share those results with that individual.
And you can explain to them that,
And
you
you
have
can
a
explain to them
cognitive
that you know they have a
problem
cognitive
and
problem.
it'll hurt and
And
they'll
you may be shocked,
go through a
but
period
you
of
can
grieving, but
help
you have to
them
help them understand who they are
and that they are healthy.
so that they
and
can
they have
know
strengths
their
and
strengths and their
weaknesses,
weaknesses
and help them understand
and
that
help that person
they
feel
can
good
have a
about who they
bright
are.
future and feel
That
better
yes,
about
you have some weaknesses and a disability, but
And yet they
you
may
can
have
still
some
find a way to live a
disabilities,
happy,
but you can
fulfilling
still
life.
find a way to live happy and fulfilling
I
life.
agree with you. It's just tough because our diploma
Because our
system
diploma
depends on passing the state
depends on
test.
passing this case
And that's a goal.
And
You
that's
have to
the goal
achieve
to
certain
have
reading levels.
certain
And
reading levels.
I think our educational system doesn't understand that. And that system has failed these children.
That's because of the state.
So it's a concern, you know.
You know,
It's getting worse because with the
getting worse
economy the way
because of the
economy the
economy
way it is, they have a lot more emphasis on abstract
they
thinking.
have a lot more emphasis on
And if you pass that
abstract
critical
thinking.
period,
And
then
if you
it's
pass that
almost
critical
impossible
period,
for
then
them
it's
to achieve
almost
that level of
impossible for them to achieve that
abstraction.
level of abstraction.
I do like your research, and I'd like that information because I think I could use that to show the parents
For parents
what
to
happens
explain what
when the
happens
child
in
misses that
period.
critical period. I think it's a good
Abstract
visual
and what happens
representation of
in
what I can say to these parents and show these parents. They're all from my school, and I'm asking for their sakes as well as my sake. Thank you very much. Hi,
Hi, I am
I'm Miko,
Micah, and
and I'm a Brown student. I started learning ASL
I started learning ASL
here this year. Sorry that I'm still learning and I'm still making some mistakes.
Struggles and I made a lot of mistakes, but
I'm wondering, I'm learning as a student.
how students
I do want to help people like me,
who were
born hearing, but growing up with a hearing loss. That's how I am, says Sanjay. So my family wants me to study and be successful, of course. They think that hearing needs to be fixed, that it's a medical problem.
Really hard, and it's a problem, and that's a medical problem.
And I'm wondering
because
how a student like me
who I am, and if I'm the same
and like
as
other
the
students
at school,
in my class
and students in my class could help other people, but if
could
they don't,
help
they are
other people if they're not doctors or scientists.
I
think there are so many ways that you can help. And I think there are many ways. In many ways, I'm happy that your parents visualized exactly what it would mean for you to be successful. And maybe that visualization
may come with nutrition
will come to fruition.
It's not black and white.
And my parents wanted me to be a surgeon.
And wanted me to grow up and.
But it really depends on how you feel. And it's important, if hearing is important for you, then going through the experience of losing your hearing will be different than that of a person who was born deaf. Just as if you were to compare someone who was born blind or who lost their vision later in life. So whether you're in a wheelchair or blind, deaf people have the hardest time. And I think that Laurent Clark,
and I think what Heather said about what you have.
I think what Heather said was that you have to.
Helen Keller said that blindness cuts you off from things, but deafness cuts you off from people. I mean, the quality of relationships is what really matters. And I think it's your decision. So you're a doctor. If other people who are not doctors or scientists, what
we can do is shift.
What can we do to shift the culture? What can we do to make a cultural change?
What we can do to make.
It requires a multidisciplinary approach. And society needs to change. For example, I as a doctor doesn't mean I can do everything.
Doesn't mean I can do everything.
I can go out and raise my flag and tell the world, but one person really can't make that much of a difference. It requires many types of people helping the many. So if you email me, we'll talk more about that.
So if you email me, we can talk more about that. Thank you very much.
Hi.
Hello.
My name is Sue.
My name is Sue.
And I'm not from Rhode Island. I'm actually from Massachusetts. And I've been there for over 30 years. So I'm looking around and I see a lot of you from Rhode Island, but I'm from Massachusetts. And there was someone who made a comment in the black with the bangs. I don't know your name. Martha. Okay. You were commenting about the Learning Center, and I thought, I was thinking about the teachers. I'm subbing at the Rhode Island School for the Deaf now, and I'm comparing that to the Learning Center. And I'm noticing, if I back up a little bit, my daughter started at the Learning Center in the parenting, early parented program. She was
program.
born deaf, of course,
But she was born deaf, of course.
and she did
but
everything at the right level.
She did everything at the right level.
We were really forced to sort of deconstruct or decondition ourselves,
We were forced to sort of deconstruct,
deprogram ourselves, what we'd been taught all of our lives. And I really had to think about my own values. It was really hard for me because my parents are hearing. And of course, parents force their values on their children. That's what happens. And the process then was so different from the process that I had with my own daughter. So anyway, my daughter was at the Learning Center as she learned value systems that were good for deaf kids, but we did have to come up with a mission statement at the Learning Center, and it just hasn't happened in Rhode Island yet. I do see struggles, and it's a struggle I went through 10 years ago at my very, where I taught at the Learning Center. But these facts are very good. So now, for all of us in the community here in Rhode Island, we really need to work together with the Rhode Island School for the Deaf and other programs to look at our own values. Are we still with hearing people? Are we still with hearing culture? Can we change and break away from that and value ourselves as deaf people again and be centered on our own deafness? I think maybe here in Rhode Island, it's time to get together, deaf and hearing, parents and teachers, and have those hard discussions and talk about what we want for deaf kids, because where are they going to get their values? My parents too, they always, parents are such an important part of their children's lives. But we do have to have these honest conversations for the sake of the kids, and I think that's what's needed here. It's happening in Massachusetts. It should happen here.
We have time for one more question.
One last question. So, my name is
I may
Catherine.
need your help.
I'm gonna need your help. I'm really bad.
I'm really bad.
It's okay. Speak your question.
I'm a student
And the
at
reason I'm here
BCC.
tonight is
The reason I'm here tonight is I have an interest in education. I believe that all children from birth, deaf and hearing, should learn how to sign.
I believe that all children from birth,
Years
deaf
ago,
and hearing
10,
should learn.
15 years
10
ago, I read an
10,
article,
15 years ago, I read an
and
article.
I've had an interest in it. I grew up wanting to know how to sign. I never knew anyone who was deaf. And now here I am, 57, trying to learn how to sign language. I'm really bad, and it's a really long process. But I have an interest in the other student. I'm really embarrassed because you just took up sign language this semester and you put me to wicked shame. I've had an interest for a lot of years to, we have a local cable access television in our town, and I'd like to take parents who have infants and toddlers and children in the school system and have them all learn how to sign, and then take students who are already in the school system and make videos and put it out on a local public access television so the whole families will learn how to sign, whether they have hearing or deaf students. And I really think that if we start it now, that there'll be a day that it won't matter whether you can hear or whether you can't. We'll all be able to communicate bilingual in this country. It is American Sign Language. And I kind of have thoughts on that, and I just wanted to say that.
And I just wanted to say
It's
that.
interesting, but I think here in America, especially, there's a lot of value placed on having one language, doing things one way. And we really need, we're thought of as a melting pot, and everyone here speaks English. And that's a way that we can all talk with each other. But one of the reasons we're here is to dispel that, because that is based on autism. 80% of the people here speak about 2 languages. My dad, in the world rather, my dad speaks Pakistani, and he actually has 7 languages. There's really no limit to how many languages people can learn. In Cambridge, we have one program for infants, and they're taught 10 languages, Russian, German. They can learn them without any problems. So yes, sign language. I often I would like to see that.
see that
But, in New York, there are some very wealthy parents who've hired deaf people to teach sign language to their
parents
kids.
hire deaf people to teach sign
Because sign is easier to learn.
because sign is
You can
easier to
learn sign, you can start picking it up at 3 months, and there's a lot of benefits for kids, deaf or hearing, to learn sign language. And so a lot of people take advantage of that.
take advantage of that.
At the same time, we have surgeons saying, we're going to give the child an implant, do not let them sign, they must learn English. And then we have these wealthy New Yorkers teaching their hearing kids to sign at 3 months. So, kids need options. There are more than 800 studies that support this approach of learning sign. There are no studies that support the approach of having an implant, but not having sign language. So,
Not having sign language.
we talk, we use gestures.
All the time about
Everyone uses gestures. They're very natural.
and how they talk and why
But why do we talk?
It's because we're closer
It's
to
almost definitely that sign language came before spoken language was even developed.
develop.
Chimps separated from humans.
Chimps separated from humans.
This was a study a while back. They developed a couple of things that were special. One was dexterity,
One was dexterity.
the ability to use fine motor movements
with our
with our hands. That's one thing that humans who are distinct from chimps developed through evolution. And a second thing is language. That's another thing that distinguishes us from chimps.
that they will learn how to say
Spoken
itself.
language is not
Spoken
a
language is
given.
not even given.
The fact that people stood up, it just made their hands suddenly free, so they could use them to sign, and also use tools and socialize with one
And also
another.
to
So
socialize with
when
one
people
another.
look back and you look at the development of the vocal cords, they came much later than dexterity in the fingers. So we were probably signing well before we were
We
speaking.
were signing much
And also the jaw
way
and the evolution of the jaw,
before.
it was allowed us to call out in addition to sign. So there were many benefits. So you
Sign language is
could
really a benefit.
you could talk in the dark. You could,
You could just sign.
but sign has other benefits as well. For example, you can sign a great distance, and somebody on the other side of the room can understand you.
At the other side of the room, they can understand you.
So you can warn people about oncoming animals. So I do believe, as I said earlier, that I think sign language came first, and that explains why deafness and sign language persist. We need more evidence of that, and the whole idea of the vocal cord developing later. We actually have the evolutionary evidence of that, but who knows why? Maybe they didn't want people talking because they would choke, so that you couldn't talk and eat at the same time, but you can certainly sign and eat at the same time. So there could be a whole evolutionary story about this and the development of language. But sign has been around for as long as humans have been speaking. Okay, I think we should stop. I want to thank you all so much. It's been a pleasure to be here. And thank you for setting this up. And thank you so much to our cart services, Jen, Carol, and Rebecca, and also our video people and our sound people. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic. I really enjoyed it. It was very in-depth and also very important.
And also very important for us.
Now, we could go on and have more dialogues and more discussion.
We must have dialogues and more discussions.
There will be
about
more
it. There will be
publications, more research, and more activity in this field. We need to change the system. So I'd like to thank you, Dr. Galati, for being one of the movers and shakers in this community.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to let all of you know, you might be a little bit hungry now. We do have some refreshments right outside the door in the hallway, so please make yourselves at home. We've got plenty of goodies for you all.
Thank you again.
Thank you all so much.